In the spring of 1989, the attention of the world turned to the center of Beijing. Tiananmen Square, the vast concrete plaza that sits at the heart of the Chinese capital, became the stage for a political drama that would determine the future of the world's most populous nation. For 7 weeks, the square was occupied by university students, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens. What began as a spontaneous expression of grief for a deceased leader evolved into a mass movement that challenged the absolute authority of the Communist Party. At the height of the demonstrations, over 1 million people filled the square and the surrounding avenues. The atmosphere was unlike anything Beijing had witnessed before. It was a mix of a political rally and a festival. Students erected tents and organized printing presses. They established their own broadcasting systems to counter state media. They eventually constructed a 30-foot statue of foam and plaster, the goddess of democracy, positioning it to face the portrait of Chairman Mao Zedong. This gathering was characterized by a high degree of discipline and organization, defying the government's initial attempts to label it as chaotic turmoil. The protests occurred against a backdrop of profound social and economic transformation. Since the death of Mao Zedong, the People's Republic of China had embarked on a program of reform and opening up. The leadership had dismantled the commune system and welcomed foreign investment. These changes had lifted millions out of poverty, but they also generated deep anxiety. Inflation was running at nearly 30%, eating into the savings of ordinary workers. Corruption was becoming visible as the children of high-ranking officials used their connections to amass wealth. The social contract that promised security in exchange for obedience was fraying. Inside the Great Hall of the People, the government was paralyzed by an internal schism. The Communist Party was divided between those who sympathized with the students' calls for reform and those who saw the protests as a counter-revolutionary threat. The elderly revolutionaries who held the ultimate power, known as the Eight Elders, viewed the unrest through the lens of their own violent history. They feared that the stability of the state was at risk and that the chaotic violence of the Cultural Revolution might return. The students, by contrast, represented a new generation. They had grown up during a period of relative openness. They listened to foreign radio, read Western philosophy, and believed that economic modernization required political transparency. The collision between these two forces created a deadlock that captivated the global media. The resolution of this standoff would result in a tragedy that fundamentally altered the trajectory of modern China. Part 1. From Chaos to Capitalism. Following the death of Mao Zedong in 1976 and the subsequent arrest of the Gang of Four, China entered a period of profound uncertainty. The decade of the Cultural Revolution had left the economy stagnant and the education system in ruins. The return of Deng Xiaoping to power in 1978 marked a decisive break from this chaotic past. At the third plenary session of the 11th Central Committee, held in December 1978, the Communist Party formally shifted its focus from ideological class struggle to economic construction. This policy became known as reform and opening up. Deng Xiaoping's vision was pragmatic. He sought to unleash the productive power of the Chinese people by introducing market mechanisms into the socialist system. In the countryside, the collective communes were dismantled. Peasants were allowed to lease land and sell their surplus crops on the open market. In the cities, special economic zones were established, most notably in Shenzhen, to attract foreign capital and technology. The results were immediate and spectacular. Agricultural output soared, and a new class of entrepreneurs began to emerge. For the first time in generations, the standard of living for the average Chinese citizen began to rise perceptibly. Bicycles were replaced by motorcycles, and color televisions began to appear in urban households. However, by the late 1980s, the side effects of this rapid transformation were becoming acutely painful. The shift from a command economy to a market economy was not smooth. To encourage production, the state allowed a dual-track pricing system. This meant that factories could sell goods produced above their state quotas at market prices, while the quota goods were sold at low state-fixed prices. This system created a massive opportunity for corruption. Officials with access to goods at the low state price could buy them and immediately resell them at the high market price, pocketing the difference. This practice, known as guandao, or official profiteering, enraged the general public. It created a perception that the Communist Party, which had once prided itself on egalitarian austerity, was becoming a club for the corrupt elite. Simultaneously, the economy was overheating. In 1988, the government attempted to lift price controls on basic goods. The result was panic buying and hoarding. Inflation spiked, reaching nearly 30% in urban centers. For workers on fixed state salaries, their purchasing power evaporated overnight. The Iron Rice Bowl, the tacit social contract where the state guaranteed employment and welfare in exchange for political loyalty, was cracking. Fear of unemployment and the inability to afford basic necessities created a reservoir of anger in the cities that went far beyond university campuses. This economic anxiety was matched by a growing intellectual ferment. Throughout the 1980s, universities became centers of debate. Western books, previously banned, were translated and devoured by students. Ideas about democracy, human rights, and the separation of powers circulated in democracy salons at Peking University and other elite institutions. The students began to regard the political system as an obstacle to the modernization of the country. Within the highest echelons of the Communist Party, there was a disagreement on how to handle this pressure. On one side were the hardliners, who believed that political control must be maintained to ensure economic stability. On the other side were the reformers, who believed that economic opening must be accompanied by political liberalization. The figurehead of the reformist camp was Hu Yaobang. Hu Yaobang served as the General Secretary of the Communist Party throughout the mid-1980s. He was a protege of Deng Xiaoping, but he was viewed as more tolerant of dissent and more sympathetic to the intellectuals. In late 1986, student demonstrations broke out in several cities, calling for local elections. Hu Yaobang refused to crack down on the students, arguing for dialogue rather than force. The party elders, a group of retired but powerful revolutionaries who held the real power behind the scenes, viewed Hu's leniency as a weakness. In January 1987, Hu Yaobang was forced to resign. He was accused of bourgeois liberalization and failing to uphold the leadership of the party. He was replaced by Zhao Ziyang, another reformer, but the message was clear. There was a limit to how much political change the party would tolerate. Hu Yaobang remained on the Politburo, but he was stripped of his real power and sidelined. To the students and intellectuals, he became a symbol of integrity, a good official who had been punished for trying to help the people. On April 8, 1989, 40 minutes into a Politburo meeting, Hu Yaobang suffered a massive heart attack. He was rushed to the hospital, but he died a week later on April 15, 1989. The death of a deposed liberal leader is a recurring trigger for political unrest in Chinese history. It offers a safe pretext for protests. Citizens can gather to mourn the dead leader, which is a traditional act of respect, while implicitly criticizing the living leaders who purged him. Within hours of the announcement of Hu's death, posters appeared on the triangular message boards at Peking University. One famous couplet read, "Those who should die serve as officials. Those who should live have died." Small groups of students began to march from the university district in Haidian to Tiananmen Square, laying wreaths at the monument to the people's heroes. The monument is a 10-story obelisk in the center of the square, dedicated to the martyrs of the revolution. By April 17th, thousands of students had gathered there. Their demands began to crystallize. They called for the rehabilitation of Hu Yaobang's reputation. They demanded that the leaders disclose their personal assets and those of their children. They asked for freedom of the press and the right to demonstrate. Crucially, at this stage, they were not calling for the overthrow of the Communist Party, but for the party to live up to its own ideals. The government announced that Hu Yaobang's official state funeral would be held on April 22nd inside the Great Hall of the People, which sits on the western edge of Tiananmen Square. The authorities decided to close off the square to the public during the ceremony to prevent disturbances. Anticipating this lockout, the students organized a massive march the night before. On the evening of April 21st, tens of thousands of students from various universities marched toward the square, bypassing police lines. They occupied the plaza and spent the night sitting in organized blocks, waiting for the funeral to begin the next morning. On the morning of April 22nd, the official funeral took place inside the Great Hall. The top leadership, including Deng Xiaoping and Premier Li Peng, paid their respects to Hu's body. Outside, on the vast concrete expanse of the square, approximately 100,000 students waited. They could hear the funeral music broadcast over the loudspeakers. As the ceremony inside concluded, the students grew restless. They wanted to present a petition to Premier Li Peng. 3 students, Zhou Yongjun, Guo Haifeng, and Zhang Zhong, stepped forward from the crowd. They walked up the granite steps leading to the massive doors of the Great Hall of the People. In a gesture that recalled the petitions of imperial times, the 3 students knelt down on the steps. They held the petition above their heads, weeping. This image was captured by foreign television crews and photographers. It was a powerful and polarizing visual. To the older generation, it looked like a traditional plea to the emperor. To the younger students, it was a humiliation. Citizens of a modern republic should not have to kneel to their public servants. The 3 students remained on their knees for nearly 45 minutes. Inside the hall, the leadership argued about what to do. Deng Xiaoping reportedly felt that bowing to student pressure would lead to chaos. Premier Li Peng did not come out to accept the petition. The doors of the Great Hall remained shut. Eventually, the 3 students stood up and returned to the crowd, empty-handed and furious. The rejection had a galvanizing effect on the movement. The students felt that the government had treated their sincere patriotism with arrogance and disdain. The sentiment in the square shifted from grief to anger. They had tried to follow the rules, they had tried to petition peacefully, and they had been ignored. If the government would not listen to a polite request, the students concluded they would have to speak louder. The mourning for Hu Yaobang was over. The protest for the future of China had begun. Part 2. Escalation, the editorial and the hunger strike. Following the kneeling incident on the steps of the Great Hall of the People, the political temperature in Beijing rose dramatically. The students returned to their campuses feeling humiliated and ignored, while the government leadership felt their authority had been directly challenged. In this volatile atmosphere, a critical tactical error occurred within the highest echelons of the Communist Party. On April 23rd, General Secretary Zhao Ziyang, the most prominent moderate voice in the leadership, departed Beijing for a scheduled state visit to North Korea. His departure left the hardline premier, Li Peng, in charge of the daily management of the crisis. Li Peng wasted no time. On the evening of April 24th, he convened a meeting of the Politburo Standing Committee. During this session, the Beijing municipal leadership presented a report that painted the student movement in the darkest possible light. They described the protests as an organized conspiracy aimed at overthrowing the Communist Party. The following morning, Li Peng and President Yang Shangkun took this report to the home of Deng Xiaoping. Although Deng Xiaoping held no official title other than chairman of the Central Military Commission, he remained the paramount leader of China. His word was final. After hearing the report, Deng concluded that the protests were a threat to the survival of the regime. He dictated his view that this was a state of turmoil designed to plunge the nation into chaos. He ordered the party to take a clear-cut stand and suppress the unrest before it spread. Deng's comments were immediately transcribed and turned into an editorial for the People's Daily, the official mouthpiece of the Communist Party. The piece was titled, "It is necessary to take a clear-cut stand against turmoil." It was broadcast on national radio on the evening of April 25th and published in the newspaper on the morning of April 26th. The editorial used harsh, uncompromising language. It accused the students of being manipulated by a tiny handful of conspirators with ulterior motives. It labeled their actions as a planned conspiracy intended to negate the leadership of the Communist Party and the socialist system. The publication of the April 26th editorial was a massive miscalculation. The government intended to intimidate the students into submission. Instead, the editorial enraged them. The vast majority of the students viewed themselves as patriotic loyalists who simply wanted the government to address corruption and inflation. To be labeled as counter-revolutionary conspirators was a deep insult. The editorial had the opposite of its intended effect. It unified the fractured student groups. Students who had previously been moderate or apathetic now felt compelled to march to prove their innocence and demand a retraction of the editorial. On April 27th, the students launched a massive demonstration that would become a turning point in the movement. The government had warned that any further protests would be met with severe consequences. Police lined the major intersections leading to Tiananmen Square. Parents and teachers pleaded with students not to go, fearing a repeat of the crackdowns of the past. Many students wrote last wills and testaments before leaving their dormitories, fully expecting to be arrested or beaten. Despite the fear, tens of thousands of students poured out of the universities in the northwest of the city. They marched under banners that read, "Long live the Communist Party" and "Patriotism is not a crime," directly countering the narrative of the editorial. As the columns of students reached the police barricades, a remarkable scene unfolded. The police stood with linked arms, forming a human wall. The students, showing immense discipline, did not attack the police. Instead, they pushed forward with the sheer weight of their numbers. Behind the students, the citizens of Beijing rallied. Workers, shopkeepers, and office clerks flooded the streets to support the marchers. They shouted at the police to make way. Faced with this overwhelming pressure from both the front and the rear, the police lines buckled and broke. The students surged through, cheering. This pattern repeated at intersection after intersection. The police, under orders not to use lethal force at this stage, were helpless against the tide of humanity. By the afternoon of April 27th, the march had reached Tiananmen Square. It was a triumphant moment. The students had defied a direct order from the paramount leader and had won. The government, realizing it had underestimated the public support for the students, adopted a softer tone. They agreed to hold dialogues with student representatives, although these meetings were largely symbolic and excluded the independent student organizations. Following the April 27th march, the energy of the movement began to dissipate. The students had made their point, and many returned to classes. The 70th anniversary of the May 4th movement came and went with another large march, but by the second week of May, the number of protesters in the square had dwindled. The movement was losing momentum, and the government adopted a strategy of waiting them out, hoping the protests would die a natural death. However, the student leadership was aware of a rapidly approaching deadline. May 15th was scheduled to be the date of a historic summit. Mikhail Gorbachev, the leader of the Soviet Union, was coming to Beijing. This was to be the first meeting between the leaders of China and the Soviet Union in 30 years, marking the end of the Sino-Soviet split. The world's media was descending on Beijing to cover the summit. Major American networks like CNN and CBS, as well as the BBC, were setting up satellite dishes. The radical faction of the student leadership, led by a 23-year-old psychology student named Chai Ling, along with activists Wang Dan and Wu Kaixi, saw this as a unique opportunity. They knew that the government cared deeply about face and international prestige. If the students could occupy Tiananmen Square during the Gorbachev visit, they would force the government to acknowledge them in front of the entire world. To revitalize the movement and mobilize the public, they decided to escalate their tactics. They announced a hunger strike. The decision to launch a hunger strike was controversial even among the students. Many felt it was too extreme. However, the emotional logic of the tactic was powerful. In Chinese culture, the relationship between the government and the people is often framed in familial terms. By starving themselves, the students were effectively children engaging in moral blackmail against their father. They were putting their lives on the line to prove their sincerity. On May 13th, 2 days before Gorbachev's arrival, several hundred students gathered at the monument to the people's heroes to begin the fast. They wore white headbands, the traditional color of mourning, signifying that they were mourning for the nation. They took a solemn oath to abstain from food until the government met two demands: a retraction of the April 26th editorial and a televised dialogue with the government that acknowledged the student movement as patriotic and democratic. The sight of the hunger strikers transformed the atmosphere in Beijing once again. As the days passed, the number of strikers grew from a few hundred to several thousand. The heat in the square was intense. Students began to faint from dehydration and hypoglycemia. The sound of ambulance sirens became the soundtrack of the city. The citizens of Beijing reacted with an outpouring of sympathy. The image of the country's best and brightest youth lying on the concrete, willing to die for their beliefs, shattered the remaining public caution. Doctors and nurses from state hospitals rushed to the square to volunteer their services, setting up makeshift field hospitals under tents. Workers stopped production to march in support. Even members of the state media marched under banners that read, "We want to speak the truth." By the time Mikhail Gorbachev's plane touched down on May 15th, Tiananmen Square was a sea of humanity. The government had planned a grand welcome ceremony for the Soviet leader in the square, complete with a military honor guard and the 21-gun salute. The students made it physically impossible for this ceremony to take place. In a humiliation for the Chinese leadership, the welcome ceremony had to be hastily relocated to the airport. The motorcade that was supposed to take Gorbachev through the center of Beijing had to be diverted to back roads to avoid the crowds. When Gorbachev met with Deng Xiaoping in the Great Hall of the People, the noise of the protest outside was audible inside the meeting rooms. The International Press Corps, originally there to cover the diplomatic summit, turned their cameras toward the square. The story was no longer the rapprochement between China and the Soviet Union, it was the uprising of the Chinese people. The hunger strike had succeeded in internationalizing the conflict. It trapped the Chinese government in a bind. They could not use force while the Soviet delegation and the foreign press were watching, but they could not allow the loss of face to continue indefinitely. Inside the square, the situation was becoming desperate. By May 17th, over 1,000 students had been hospitalized. The sanitation conditions were deteriorating, with garbage piling up and a lack of running water. The student leaders, particularly Chai Ling, gave emotional speeches over the loudspeakers, declaring that they were prepared to sacrifice themselves to awaken the Chinese nation. The rhetoric became apocalyptic. The hunger strike also forced a crisis within the Communist Party leadership. Zhao Ziyang, who had returned from North Korea, argued that the government should concede to the students' demands to save their lives. He proposed retracting the editorial and opening a genuine dialogue. Li Peng and the hardliners argued that any concession would lead to the collapse of the party's authority. They believed that the hunger strike was a form of political coercion that could not be rewarded. As the ambulances screamed back and forth along Chang'an Avenue, carrying the fainting students to hospitals, the sympathy of the public turned into fury at the government's inaction. Support demonstrations were erupting in Shanghai, Chengdu, Xi'an, and nearly every major provincial capital. The movement was now a national insurrection. The paralysis of the government, caused by the split between Zhao Ziyang and Li Peng, created a power vacuum that the protesters filled. But as the Gorbachev visit concluded and the foreign dignitaries departed, the protective shield around the students began to evaporate. The hardliners were preparing to play their final card. Part 3. The Split, Martial Law and the Citizens' Blockade. By May 18, 1989, the hunger strike in Tiananmen Square had entered its 6th day. The situation had become a medical and political emergency. Thousands of students were collapsing from dehydration and hypoglycemia. The sound of sirens was constant as ambulances ferried the unconscious from the square to the overcrowded hospitals. The public sympathy for the students had reached a fever pitch, with over 1 million people marching in the streets of Beijing to support the hunger strikers. The pressure on the government to act was unbearable. In an attempt to defuse the crisis, the government agreed to a televised meeting between the Premier, Li Peng, and the student leaders. The encounter took place in the Great Hall of the People on May 18th. It remains one of the most surreal moments in Chinese political history. On one side of the velvet-covered conference table sat Li Peng and other high-ranking officials dressed in stiff Mao suits and Western business ties. On the other side sat the student representatives, appearing emaciated and exhausted. The most striking figure was Wu Caixi, a 21-year-old student from Beijing Normal University. He had been on a hunger strike for nearly a week. He arrived at the meeting wearing hospital pajamas, clutching an oxygen bag to help him breathe. At one point, unable to sit upright, he curled up in a chair, creating a stark visual contrast between the frailty of the youth and the rigidity of the state. Premier Li Peng began the meeting with a lengthy, formal greeting, attempting to establish a paternalistic tone. Wu Caixi interrupted him. In a breach of protocol that shocked the television audience, the student cut off the Premier of the People's Republic. He told Li Peng that they did not have time for pleasantries while students were starving in the square. He demanded that the government address the students' demands immediately. Li Peng, visibly agitated, retorted that the students were being impolite. He lectured them like a stern father disciplining unruly children. He stated that the government had to maintain order and that the capital had fallen into anarchy. The meeting lasted for an hour but achieved nothing. The two sides were speaking different languages. The government spoke of stability and authority, while the students spoke of moral urgency and patriotism. The broadcast was intended to show the government's willingness to listen, but instead it painted the leadership as cold and out of touch. The hunger strike continued. While the public drama played out on television, a far more consequential struggle was taking place behind the closed doors of the leadership compound at Zhongnanhai. The Communist Party Politburo Standing Committee, the supreme decision-making body of the country, was effectively split down the middle. On one side was General Secretary Zhao Ziyang. Zhao had been the architect of China's economic reforms in the 1980s. He believed that the students were fundamentally patriotic and that their demands for an end to corruption were aligned with the party's own goals. He argued that the only way to resolve the crisis was to retract the April 26 editorial that had labeled the movement as turmoil. He proposed investigating the corruption of officials' families and opening a dialogue on political reform. Opposing him was Premier Li Peng and the hardline faction. They argued that the protests were not about corruption, but about the survival of the Communist Party. They believed that retreating in the face of public pressure would lead to the collapse of the regime, similar to what was beginning to happen in Eastern Europe. The deadlock was broken by the Eight Elders. These were a group of retired revolutionary veterans who held no formal executive positions but wielded ultimate authority through their personal prestige and military connections. The most powerful among them was Deng Xiaoping. On the night of May 17th, the Standing Committee was summoned to Deng Xiaoping's residence. In the presence of the elders, the vote was essentially a formality. Deng Xiaoping had decided that the turmoil had dragged on too long and that the capital was out of control. He declared that the party could not retreat. He ordered the imposition of martial law to restore order. Zhao Ziyang refused to support the use of the military against the students. He realized that his political career was over. He submitted his resignation, though it was not immediately accepted as the party wanted to maintain a facade of unity. In the early hours of May 19th, knowing that the army was coming, Zhao Ziyang made one final tragic appearance. At 4 o'clock in the morning, a bus carried Zhao and Li Peng to Tiananmen Square. Zhao Ziyang, looking old and exhausted, stepped out into the crowd of students. He held a bullhorn and spoke to the hunger strikers huddled in one of the buses used as a shelter. His words were captured on film and have become the epitaph of the reform era. He began by saying, "Students, we have come too late." He did not mention martial law or the internal political fight. Instead, he spoke as a grandfather figure. He urged the students to end the hunger strike, to eat, and to preserve their health for the future. He told them that they were still young and that the future belonged to them. Tears ran down his face as he spoke. Standing behind him, Premier Li Peng looked on with a grim expression. Li Peng stayed only for a few moments before fleeing back to the safety of his car. Zhao Ziyang finished his speech, bowed to the students, and left. It was the last time he would ever be seen in public. Following this appearance, Zhao was stripped of his powers and placed under house arrest, where he would remain until his death 16 years later. With the moderate faction purged, the hardliners moved to execute their plan. On May the 20th, Premier Li Peng appeared on state television to formally declare martial law. The decree covered the central districts of Beijing. It prohibited all demonstrations, petitions, and strikes. It authorized the security forces to use any means necessary to clear the streets. The government mobilized the People's Liberation Army. They did not rely solely on the Beijing garrison, whose loyalty was suspect due to their proximity to the local population. Instead, they ordered divisions from across the country to converge on the capital. The 27th Army from Shanxi Province, the 38th Army from Beiding, and the 65th Army were among those deployed. The plan was for the troops to move from the suburbs into the city center on the night of May 20th and secure Tiananmen Square by the morning of May 21st. The leadership assumed that the mere presence of tanks and armored personnel carriers would terrify the population into submission. They severely underestimated the resolve of the citizens of Beijing. As the convoys of military trucks approached the city from the outskirts, they ran into a wall of humanity. The entire city had come out to stop them. Factory workers, shopkeepers, grandmothers and civil servants flooded the streets. They set up makeshift barricades using public buses, concrete road dividers and coal trucks. At key intersections like Gucheng, Gongjufen and Hujialu, the scenes were extraordinary. The army trucks were swarmed by tens of thousands of civilians, overwhelming them with words and kindness. Many of the soldiers were young conscripts from the countryside. They'd been kept in isolation without access to news for days. Their officers had told them that Beijing was in the grip of a violent counter-revolutionary uprising and that they were coming to restore order. When the canvas flaps of their trucks were pulled back, they saw old women offering them popsicles and tea. They saw mothers holding up babies and students reading newspapers aloud to them, explaining that the movement was peaceful and patriotic. The citizens lectured the troops. They appealed to the tradition of the People's Liberation Army as the people's soldiers. They asked, how can the People's Army hurt the people? They scolded the officers, telling them that the students in the square were the same age as the soldiers in the trucks. At the Lulichao intersection, students and workers surrounded a convoy of the 38th Army. They engaged in a debate that lasted for 2 days. The soldiers sat in their trucks, rifles between their knees, staring out at the sea of faces. The psychological pressure was immense. The officers realized that they could not move forward without running over civilians, an order they were not yet willing to give or obey. In some areas, the citizens effectively captured the army units. They slashed the tires of the trucks or siphoned off the fuel to prevent them from moving. They formed human chains across the wide avenues, refusing to budge. The paralysis was total. The mighty military machine of the People's Republic of China had been stopped by unarmed citizens. Inside the leadership compound, the failure of the initial martial law enforcement was a humiliation. The government had lost control of the capital. The police had vanished from the streets, yet the city remained orderly. The students and workers directed traffic and organized neighborhood watch groups to prevent looting. They were proving that the turmoil described by the government was a fabrication. The city was functioning better without the government than with it. Faced with this stalemate, the military leadership decided to withdraw the troops to temporary bases on the outskirts of the city. They realized they needed time to regroup and re-educate the soldiers before attempting another advance. On May 21st and 22nd, the army convoys slowly reversed out of the suburbs. The citizens cheered, believing they had won a great victory. They had stood up to the tanks, and the tanks had turned back. A festive atmosphere returned to the streets. The hunger strike was officially called off by the student leadership, who shifted their tactic to a sit-in occupation of the square. They believed they could hold the square indefinitely. However, the retreat was merely tactical. Deng Xiaoping and the party elders viewed the citizens' blockade as a terrifying indication of how deep the rot had gone. They saw the fraternization between the soldiers and the civilians as a mortal threat to the party's control over the gun. They determined that the next time the army moved, there would be no hesitation and no debate. As the troops pulled back to their staging grounds in the countryside surrounding Beijing, political commissars began an intense campaign of indoctrination within the ranks. The soldiers were cut off from all outside information. They were shown fabricated footage of students attacking soldiers. They were told that the protesters were dangerous rebels backed by foreign powers who wanted to destroy China. The military was being hardened for a different kind of mission. Meanwhile, in the center of the city, the adrenaline of the blockade began to fade. The students were left in possession of the square, but they were exhausted, dirty, and increasingly divided. The movement had survived the declaration of martial law, but they were now trapped in a waiting game against a regime that was preparing for a decisive and violent resolution. The euphoria of late May was about to give way to the ominous silence of early June. Part 4. The Lull and the Goddess. Following the successful blockade of the military convoys on May 20th and 21st, a strange and uneasy stalemate descended upon Beijing. The army had retreated to the outskirts of the capital, leaving the city center effectively under the control of the protesters. For a brief moment, it appeared that the people had won a decisive victory. However, as the final days of May 1989 ticked by, the energy within Tiananmen Square began to stagnate. The square itself had been transformed into a sprawling, chaotic shanty town. Hundreds of public buses, commandeered by the students, sat motionless in rows, their windows covered with slogans and flags. Tents sent from Hong Kong and Taiwan dotted the concrete. The sanitation situation was becoming critical. The heat of the Beijing summer was setting in, and the stench of garbage and human waste hung heavy in the air. The composition of the crowd was also changing. Many of the original students from the elite Beijing universities, exhausted and dirty, had retreated to their dormitories to rest. Their places were taken by students arriving by train from the provinces, from Shanghai, Xi'an, and Changsha, who were eager to join the revolution they had seen on television. The leadership of the movement was fracturing. The student headquarters, known as the Defend Tiananmen Square Command, was plagued by infighting and paranoia. Arguments erupted over whether to withdraw from the square or to dig in. Radical leaders like Chai Ling argued for staying until the bitter end, believing that only bloodshed would awaken the nation, while more moderate voices suggested declaring victory and leaving while they still had the initiative. By May 27th, the number of protesters in the square had dwindled significantly. The movement was in danger of fizzling out due to attrition and boredom. The student leadership realized they needed a powerful symbol to revitalize the protests and bring the citizens of Beijing back to the square. They turned to the Central Academy of Fine Arts. The students at the academy were exhausted, but they accepted the challenge. They resolved to build a statue that would serve as a spiritual focal point for the movement. They had only 3 days to complete the project before the projected unveiling on May 30th. Working around the clock in their studio near the Forbidden City, the art students created a design that combined elements of Western classical sculpture with the style of socialist realism. To save time, they adapted a study model of a man grasping a pole, cutting off the lower half and adding a female face and robes. The figure held a torch with 2 hands. Because the statue was to be 33 feet tall, it was impossible to transport it in one piece. The students built it in sections using a wire armature, packing foam and plaster. On the night of May 29th, the components were loaded onto flatbed tricycles. A procession of art students moved through the dark streets of Beijing, transporting the disjointed limbs and torso of the giant figure. They arrived in Tiananmen Square and began the assembly process under spotlights. As the sun rose on May 30th, the scaffolding was removed. The goddess of democracy stood directly facing the giant portrait of Mao Zedong that hangs on the Tiananmen Gate. The symbolism was unmistakable. The white, plaster figure looked the great helmsman in the eye, holding her torch of freedom up against the symbol of authoritarian control. The statue was an immediate sensation. Hundreds of thousands of people flocked back to the square to see it. The mood of the protest shifted from a grim siege back to a festival of hope. The statue gave the movement a second wind, but it also enraged the leadership in Zhongnanhai. For the Communist Party elders, the goddess of democracy was the final straw. They viewed the statue as an explicit challenge to their legitimacy. The resemblance to the American Statue of Liberty, though the students insisted it was distinct, fueled the paranoia of the hardliners that the entire movement was a color revolution orchestrated by the United States. Deng Xiaoping and the influential group of retired leaders known as the 8 Elders decided that the time for patience had passed. They concluded that the retreat of the army on May 20th had been interpreted by the students as weakness. They believed that the existence of the communist regime was now at stake. If they did not clear the square, they feared China would slide into the same chaos that was engulfing the Soviet bloc in Eastern Europe. On June 2nd, the order was given to clear Tiananmen Square. This time, the military leadership ensured there would be no repetition of the humiliation of May 20th. They mobilized nearly 200,000 troops. Crucially, they relied heavily on units from outside the Beijing military region. The 27th Army, based in Shaanxi province, was selected to spearhead the assault. These troops were rural conscripts, often from isolated mountain backgrounds. They spoke a different dialect than the citizens of Beijing. For days, they had been held in closed camps at the airport and in rural bases, cut off from television and newspapers. Political commissars drilled them with the narrative that Beijing had been overrun by violent counter-revolutionary thugs who were killing soldiers. The military also changed its tactics. Instead of driving trucks openly down the main avenues, they began to infiltrate the city. On the morning of June 2nd, a strange incident occurred that served as a grim foreshadowing of the violence to come. A police jeep swerved off the road and crashed into a pedestrian barrier in the Muxidi district, a few miles west of the square. When curious citizens investigated the wreck, they found the vehicle was packed with weapons, steel helmets, and handcuffs. Rumors spread instantly that the army was smuggling weapons into the city to arm provocateurs, who would then attack soldiers to justify a crackdown. Later that day, thousands of soldiers attempted to jog into the city dressed in civilian clothes and white shirts. They were unarmed and carried no identification. The citizens of Beijing, now hyper-vigilant, spotted the military boots and the disciplined formation of the joggers. The crowd surrounded them and blocked their path. The soldiers, looking confused and humiliated, were forced to retreat. However, these skirmishes were merely probes. The main force was gathering on the ring roads. The 27th Army and the 38th Army were equipping their soldiers with AK-47 assault rifles and issuing live ammunition. The tanks and armored personnel carriers were fueled. The strict orders of do not open fire that had governed the previous weeks were being rescinded. The new orders were simple and chilling. No one is permitted to impede the martial law enforcement troops. Clear the square by 0600 hours on June 4th. Use any means necessary. Inside the square, the atmosphere on the evening of June 2nd was surreal. A concert was being held around the base of the goddess of democracy. The Taiwanese pop singer Hu Dejian, who had joined the hunger strike in solidarity, was singing to the students. The crowd swayed and sang along, unaware that the ring of steel was tightening around them. The dialogue had ended. The political maneuvering was over. The stage was set for the darkest night in the history of the People's Republic. The lull had broken, and the storm was about to break. Part 5. The Clearing. The night of June 3rd and 4th. On the evening of June 3rd, 1989, a warm summer breeze drifted through Beijing. Despite the martial law decree that had been in place for 2 weeks, the streets were not empty. The citizens of the capital, having successfully blocked the army just days earlier, remained defiant. They believed that the People's Liberation Army would never fire on the people. They believed that at worst, the soldiers would use tear gas, rubber bullets, and electric batons. This miscalculation would prove fatal. At 6:30 in the evening, the state television and loudspeakers across the city began broadcasting an ominous emergency notice. The message warned citizens to stay indoors and stated that the security forces had the authority to use all necessary means to clear the square. While some residents heeded the warning, thousands of others rushed into the streets, moving toward the major intersections to reinforce the barricades. They were preparing for a repeat of the non-violent blockade that had worked so well in May. The assault began in earnest around 10 o'clock at night. The primary thrust came from the west, moving along the Avenue of Eternal Peace, or Chang'an Avenue. This is the main artery of Beijing, a wide, straight boulevard that runs directly past the leadership compound and into Tiananmen Square. The force assigned to clear this route was the 38th Army. The first major confrontation took place at Muxidi, a residential district about 3 miles west of the square. This area was home to many high-ranking party officials and civil servants living in high-rise apartment blocks that lined the avenue. The citizens had erected a massive barricade at the Muxidi Bridge, using trolleybuses positioned sideways and setting them on fire to create a wall of flame. When the vanguard of the 38th Army arrived at the bridge, they did not stop to negotiate as they had in May. They fired tear gas and stun grenades into the crowd. The protesters responded by throwing bricks and rocks. Then, the crack of automatic gunfire split the air. At first, the crowd cheered. They assumed the soldiers were firing into the air or using blanks. However, as the front rows of the crowd began to collapse, the reality set in. The soldiers were firing live ammunition directly into the mass of people. These were battlefield weapons, Type 56 assault rifles, the Chinese version of the AK-47. The bullets were high-velocity rounds designed to tumble upon impact, causing massive internal injuries. Panic ensued. The crowd broke and ran, but many stayed behind to help the fallen. In a display of desperate courage, rickshaw drivers and pedicab operators pedaled into the line of fire to pick up the wounded. The flatbed tricycles, usually used to haul cabbage or coal, became makeshift ambulances, their wooden beds slick with blood as they raced toward the nearby Fuxing hospital. The soldiers of the 38th Army advanced methodically. They also fired at the buildings lining the avenue. Residents who had stepped out onto their balconies to watch the events were shot. Bullets shattered the windows of the apartments of senior officials. The terrifying noise of the gunfire echoed off the concrete buildings, rolling east toward the square. As the army broke through Muxidi, they continued their march east, passing through the Saidan intersection. At every barricade, the scene repeated itself, resistance from the citizens followed by overwhelming lethal force. By midnight, the army had secured the western approach to the city center. Inside Tiananmen Square, the atmosphere was one of confusion and terror. The students could hear the gunfire getting closer. They could see the tracer rounds arcing across the night sky in the west. The first casualties began to arrive at the medical tents in the square, carried by weeping students on bicycles. The blood-soaked clothes of the victims were the first tangible proof that the government was killing its own citizens. Over the loudspeakers, the student leadership led by Chai Ling urged the students to remain calm and non-violent. They famously broadcast instructions to sacrifice yourselves and to greet the soldiers with love. However, the anger in the square was boiling over. Some students and workers gathered Molotov cocktails and iron bars, preparing for a last stand. At 1 o'clock in the morning on June 4th, the army officially entered Tiananmen Square. An armored personnel carrier, separated from its unit, roared into the square from the south. It smashed through the barricades but became entangled in the debris. The crowd, enraged by the slaughter they had witnessed on the approach roads, swarmed the vehicle. They covered it with blankets, soaked in gasoline, and set it on fire. The crew was forced to evacuate. In the chaos, the soldiers were beaten by the mob, and one was reportedly killed. This incident would later be used heavily by state media to justify the crackdown as a response to violent rioting. By 2 o'clock in the morning, the main force of the army had surrounded the square. Tens of thousands of soldiers, backed by tanks and armored vehicles, sealed off all exits. The remaining protesters, numbering several thousand, retreated to the steps of the monument to the people's heroes in the center of the plaza. They were surrounded. Facing the prospect of a massacre within the square itself, a group of 4 intellectuals known as the Four Gentlemen decided to intervene. This group included the rock star Hu Dejian and the literary critic Liu Xiaobo. They believed that further resistance was futile and would only lead to the slaughter of the students. They grabbed a van and drove it toward the line of troops at the northern end of the square. Hu Dejian negotiated with a political commissar of the martial law troops. The commissar was impatient. He told Hu that the soldiers were exhausted and on edge, and that he could not guarantee they would hold their fire if the students did not leave immediately. A deal was struck. If the students withdrew peacefully, the army would leave a corridor open in the southeast corner of the square. Hu Dejian rushed back to the monument to persuade the student leaders. The debate was fierce. Some leaders, like Feng Condé, wanted to put it to a vote. Others wanted to stay and die. At 4 o'clock in the morning, the lights in Tiananmen Square were suddenly cut. The vast plaza was plunged into total darkness. This was a psychological tactic designed to induce panic. The only light came from the sparks of tank treads on the pavement and the fires burning on the periphery. Over the student loudspeakers, Feng Condé conducted a voice vote. He asked the crowd to shout, "Stay" or "Go." The result was a chaotic roar of noise. Feng, interpreting the sound in favor of survival, announced that the decision had been made to withdraw. At 4:30 in the morning, the evacuation began. The students linked arms and marched slowly down the steps of the monument. They moved toward the southeast corner, singing the Internationale and weeping. They passed through a gauntlet of soldiers who stared at them with weapons drawn. As the students vacated the square, the army moved in to reclaim the space. Tanks rolled over the tents that had been the students' homes for weeks. The goddess of democracy, the symbol of the movement, was toppled by a tank and crushed into powder. By 5:40 in the morning, Tiananmen Square was empty of protesters. The red flag of the People's Republic was raised over a wasteland of crushed tents and debris. However, the violence did not end with the clearing of the square. As the column of students retreated to the west, back toward their universities, they reached the Lubuku intersection. A column of tanks, moving rapidly to chase the protesters, fired tear gas into the retreating crowd. One tank, number 106, accelerated and plowed directly into the back of the student formation. 11 students were crushed to death on the spot, their bicycles and bodies flattened into the asphalt. Throughout the daylight hours of June 4th, sporadic fighting continued. Parents who went out to look for their missing children were shot by nervous soldiers who fired at anything that moved. The hospitals were overwhelmed. Because the government forbade the recording of deaths, the true toll of the night of June 3rd and 4th remains unknown. The Chinese Red Cross initially estimated 2,600 deaths, a figure they quickly retracted under pressure. The Chinese government later claimed the number was 241, including soldiers. Foreign intelligence estimates and eyewitness accounts generally place the number of dead between 800 and 3,000. By the evening of June 4th, Beijing was a conquered city. The army occupied every major intersection. Smoke from burning buses rose into the summer sky. The reform era, with its promise of political openness, had been crushed under the treads of the Type 59 tanks. The Communist Party had retained its power, but the bond of trust between the government and the people had been severed in a night of bloodshed. Part 6. Tank Man and the Aftermath. On the morning of June 5, 1989, the center of Beijing was a conquered zone. The smoke from the burning buses had begun to clear, revealing a wide avenue occupied by the People's Liberation Army. The citizens of the capital, shell-shocked by the violence of the previous 2 nights, largely stayed off the streets. However, the Foreign Press Corps, positioned on the balconies of the Beijing Hotel overlooking Chang'an Avenue, kept their cameras rolling. It was from this vantage point that they captured the defining image of the 20th century. Around noon, a column of 18 Type 59 main battle tanks began to move east along the Avenue of Eternal Peace, leaving Tiananmen Square. As the lead tank accelerated, a solitary man walked out from the sidewalk. He was dressed in a simple white shirt and black trousers, holding a shopping bag in each hand. He walked calmly into the middle of the wide boulevard and stood directly in the path of the approaching armor. The tank attempted to swerve to the right to bypass him. The man stepped to his right, blocking the path again. The tank corrected to the left. The man stepped to the left. The massive war machine, capable of crushing barricades and vehicles, ground to a halt. The entire column behind it stopped. For a few surreal moments, there was a standoff between a single unarmed citizen and the might of the Chinese military. The man then climbed onto the hull of the tank. He stood on the turret and spoke to the soldiers inside. While the exact words were not recorded, witnesses reported that he asked them why they were there and told them to go home. Eventually, the man climbed down. 2 figures dressed in blue rushed out from the crowd and grabbed him, hustling him away into the safety or perhaps the custody of the onlookers. To this day, the identity of the tank man remains unknown. The British tabloids named him Wang Weilin, but this has never been confirmed. Whether he was executed, imprisoned, or simply melted back into the population remains a state secret. However, the image of his defiance became the global symbol of the movement, representing the moral victory of the human spirit over the machinery of state violence. While the Tank Man incident played out on television screens across the world, the Chinese government began a ruthless, systematic crackdown. The time for dialogue was over. The time for purging had begun. On June 13th, the Ministry of Public Security issued a most wanted list of 21 student leaders. Their faces and descriptions were broadcast repeatedly on state television, accompanied by a telephone number for citizens to report their whereabouts. Wang Dan, the intellectual voice of the movement, was number 1 on the list. He went into hiding but was captured in July. He would spend years in prison before being exiled to the United States. Wu Kaixi, the student who had scolded the premier, and Xai Ling, the commander of the square, managed to evade capture. They were smuggled out of China through a secret network known as Operation Yellowbird. This underground railroad, organized by activists and triad members in Hong Kong, helped hundreds of dissidents escape via speedboat and cargo ship to Western safety. The crackdown extended far beyond the students. The government drew a sharp distinction between the students, whom they viewed as misguided, and the workers, whom they labeled as violent thugs or counter-revolutionary rioters. The workers who had burned the tanks and manned the barricades faced swift and harsh justice. Public sentencing rallies were held in stadiums, followed by immediate executions. Thousands of ordinary citizens were imprisoned for the crime of disrupting social order. In the corridors of power, the political reckoning was equally severe. General Secretary Zhao Ziyang, who had tried to negotiate with the students, was formally stripped of all his positions. He was accused of splitting the party and supporting the turmoil. He was placed under house arrest in a quiet courtyard home in Beijing, where he lived in isolation until his death in 2005. With Zhao removed and Deng Xiaoping wishing to remain in semi-retirement, the Communist Party needed a new face. They needed someone who was tough enough to maintain order, but savvy enough to manage the economy. They looked to Shanghai. Jiang Zemin, the party secretary of Shanghai, had managed to quell the student protests in his city without calling in the army. He had closed down a liberal newspaper, the World Economic Herald, showing his political reliability, but had used police and workers' militias rather than tanks to clear the streets. Jiang Zemin was airlifted to Beijing and installed as the general secretary. His ascension marked the beginning of the third generation of leadership. Jiang's task was to stabilize a regime that had lost its legitimacy in the eyes of the people and the world. China faced immediate diplomatic sanctions from the United States and the European Union. Tourism collapsed and foreign investment dried up. To survive, the Communist Party forged a new, unspoken social contract with the Chinese people, often referred to by historians as the Grand Bargain. The terms were simple. The party would deliver rapid economic growth and stability, and in exchange, the people would relinquish all demands for political freedom. The subject of democratic reform was taken off the table permanently. Deng Xiaoping solidified this direction in 1992 with his famous Southern Tour. Despite his advanced age, Deng traveled to the special economic zones in the south, visiting factories and ports. He declared that to get rich is glorious and warned that without economic development, the party would die. This kick-started the massive economic boom of the 1990s and 2000s. The energy that had been poured into political protest in 1989 was redirected into commerce and entrepreneurship. The events of 1989 were subjected to a campaign of organized amnesia. The government erased the protests from history textbooks. The internet in China, behind the Great Firewall, was scrubbed of all references to June 4th. Search terms like 6-4, Tiananmen, and even tank were censored. A generation grew up knowing little to nothing about what had happened in their own capital. The Tiananmen Square protests were the last major challenge to the rule of the Chinese Communist Party. The tragedy ended the era of idealism that characterized the 1980s and ushered in the era of high-speed economic growth and authoritarian stability that defines China today. The goddess of democracy was destroyed, but the question she posed, whether a nation can modernize its economy without modernizing its politics, remains the central unresolved question of the Chinese century. This podcast was entirely produced by Andrew Scott. If you have any suggestions for topics or improvements, please get in contact.